All right, chapter 5, part 2. So we are moving on to our second tissue class, which is connective tissue. So the functions of our connective tissue. So they help to connect different organs. So for example, tendons connecting muscle to bone, ligaments connecting bone to bone. They provide support for the body, so our bones do, as well as the cartilage that sits in between the bones at some of your joints in order to cushion the bone connection. Help to protect the body, so our cranium protecting our brain, ribs and sternum protecting our chest. They create the white blood cells in our red bone marrow in order to fight off any kind of pathogen. The bones, when muscles pull on them, allow our body to move. They are a storage site for fat, calcium, and phosphorus. They are also a part of heat production, so brown fat in infants, when it is metabolized or broken down, the broken down process isn't completely efficient, and so some of that energy that's released is lost as heat, which is good because babies need it. And then lastly, transport, so blood being a connective tissue and also being the one that transport our nutrients and waste around the body. So with this category, it actually has most of your different types of tissues in there. In this one, the cells are going to occupy less space than the matrix or what's in between the cells. Depending on your connective tissue type, you could have almost no blood vessels or a ton of blood vessels, so it just depends on your type of tissue. And just as one way of identifying your different connective tissue types is many of them have circular structures in them. So for example, as you're working on the tissue exam material, and we'll see this as we're going through, the bone has a circular structure, blood, of course, our blood cells, cartilage, these openings that we call lacunae, they are circular in shape, as well as our adipose or our cells in our fat tissue. Those, because a storing of fat, the cell kind of looks very rounded because it's basically a big fat balloon. Okay, so in our connective tissue, we do have different types of cells, and yes, you need to know these. So our fibroblasts are our builder cells. So they're making up the matrix in between the cells. They're helping to provide structure and support. So even in our cartilage and our bone tissue, the blast cells are still the builder cells. Next three types are all white blood cells, part of our immune system. So that'd be the leukocytes, our macrophages, and our plasma cells. So our leukocytes are going to directly attack a pathogen, so they are killers for our immune system. The macrophages, they'll also kill, but they kill in a specific manner where they literally eat the pathogen. The plasma cells, they're actually a type of leukocyte, but then they become the plasma cells, so a little bit more mature and specialized. Oops. Okay, so plasmas, they make antibodies which will bind to pathogens specifically and therefore be able to kill that pathogen off. Okay, next two types, we have mast cells, and these are just helper cells along our blood vessels. Adipocytes, which are storing our triglycerides, so our lipid storage molecule. So in our connective tissue, especially in that matrix, we have different types of fibers. So we have three different types of fibers. We have collagenous fibers. This is made out of a collagen protein, so very tough, flexible, stretch resistant, so this gives good structural support. Reticular fibers are more like a scaffold, so they're branched. They help form the shape of our spleen, which we'll talk more in detail in chapter 21, which is the immune system. But its job is to store red blood cells, white blood cells, and can adjust our blood volume by using different plasma transfers. The lymph nodes, so if you've ever been sick and you go to the doctor and the doctor is stabbing you in the neck, it's because they're feeling for those lymph nodes. They're seeing if they've become swollen, seeing if there's some kind of activity. The last one are elastic fibers, so like elastic, like a rubber band gives a stretch and support for those types of tissues that have the elastic fibers in them. Okay, the only one I'm going to go over here, just because I get to step on my soapbox. So between the fibers, we do have different fillers in there. So we have glycosaminoglycans called GAGs. One particular one that's fairly well known is chondroitin sulfate. So you'll see it sold as a nutritional supplement at a pharmacy or what have you, or hyaluronic acid. Unfortunately, even with the dietary supplement, all you're doing is giving your body the correct amino acids in order to make this, because once you take that supplement into your body, your stomach is going to break it down. When it breaks it down, it's broken down into its amino acids, so it doesn't stay in that shape. So we have other conjugate molecules that are also in our matrix space. So part protein, part glucose, or carbohydrate, type of molecules that just give kind of a structural support inside that matrix. So it's space between cells. Okay, so different types of connective tissue. So some of our connective tissue is loose, so there's a bunch of space in between the cells. So those types would be the areolar and reticular. Some are more densely packed together because they're more structural support and they need to be packed together, need to be tough. So depending on how the fibers are arranged in that tissue, they're either dense regular or dense irregular. So we'll get to examples of that later. Okay, so areolar tissue, one of our loose types. So in areolar tissue, it has all 6 types of our connective tissue cells. So it has fibroblasts. It has all of your white blood cells. So this is in a space where they're close to epithelial tissue. Those white blood cells are right there. So just in case something gets through the epithelial tissue, they're right there to attack the pathogen. They have fibers that are running in random directions. So that's why they're kind of loosely organized. But it also gives the ability of that tissue to move around more. So this is found in almost every part of the body, so around blood vessels and nerves, so that's extending around every part of your body. And almost every epithelial type of tissue rests on a type of areolar tissue. So again, our epithelial tissue, they don't have blood vessels, so they rely on nutrients that diffuse from the connective tissue below it. So areolar tissue, a lot of blood vessels, so we have plenty of nutrients in that connective tissue space that can diffuse. So here's an example. So our dark spots are our cells. We have different types of fiber. So these big long ones are our collagen fibers through there. We also have the elastic fibers running through there. We don't have reticular in this one, but they'd be more kind of branch shaped looking like this. Okay, so a lot of blood vessels in this type of tissue. So here's a reticular one, so kind of more branch shaped, and that's just gives structural support. So for example, here, example of the spleen. And then into our dense tissue types for connective. So regular, because there's an obvious pattern. So if I was drawing this out on this side, I'd still be able to make the same wavy pattern because the fibers are in a organized fashion. So densely packed, they're parallel to each other, so we know exactly where the cells would be. In between there, you can't really see too well on the microscope, the little dots, but those are where the cells are, and the rest of it is filled in with the fiber, so that's why it fits within the connective tissue category. So this example is found in, and I'm going to be specific on this, your calcaneal tendon or your Achilles tendon, so extending from the calcaneal or heel bone going into your calf muscles. Partially because that's on your, well, part of that's on the bone exam and part of that's on the muscle exam. Okay, so next one is dense irregular. So all these little wavy patches that kind of look like cute little swirls, those are fibers that are in some kind of random arrangement. So I couldn't guess what the pattern is going to be if I was trying to draw this out on this outside portion just because they're in random swirls. So we see our little dots, those are our cells. Connective tissue, again, a bunch of stuff that's in between it. Okay, next connective tissue type is adipose. So this is our fat storage tissue. A lot of space between cells because it's filled with triglycerides, so we store up that energy. So the number of cells we have is pretty stable. It's just how much fat is stored is what changes. Our fat is recycled, so the triglycerides are broken apart and put back together, and that way we make sure that the molecules aren't getting damaged. Just from normal activity, sometimes the oxidants that are formed, sometimes they can damage stuff. So in our adipose tissue, we have two different types. Oh yeah. We have white and brown. White fat is the only fat that's found in adults. Brown fat is what's found in fetuses, infants, and children. So white fat, main focus is for storage of the triglycerides. Brown fat, there's a bunch of other enzymes. This is why it gets its color. It also helps to produce heat for their tiny little bodies. Okay, so microscope picture. So when we slice this tissue, we've opened up the cells, and so all the fat that was inside here is now gone. So in our cartoon, we actually can see it where they drew in the fat, but it's no longer gone. Those triglycerides are not there. Okay, so going back to our round structure situation, so the openings in the cells are what gives it that kind of round shape, because it's just like a fat balloon. That's what it's doing. It's storing stuff, provides insulation for the body as well as cushioning. So, if you have fat on your butt, you fall in your butt, at least you have a little bit of cushion. Okay, next set is different types of cartilages. So with our cartilages, they're kind of stiff, but they do have some flexibility because they're in areas where there is some movement. Some cartilages are between bones. Some are giving shape to certain areas. So like our ear, the tip part of our nose, as well as our larynx, which is the top part of our throat, where you have your vocal cords in that area. Okay, so going back to our 6 different cell types for connective tissue, we have our blast cells, except for in cartilage, it has its own specific name, and that is a chondroblast. So still a blast cell, still a builder cell, except for cartilage, it has a special name. So when those chondroblasts eventually build the matrix around themselves, they end up getting trapped in a little cave called a lacunae. When they're trapped, then they become chondrocytes. So just site is just another way of saying cell. So these cartilage cells are what's called your mature cells, and they're just kind of stuck there where they are. They're not stuck there and just don't do anything. They do help monitor what's going on in your cartilage and helps with signaling and that. So with our cartilage, it does have a surrounding membrane or sheath of dense irregular connective tissue called the perichondrium, and it just adds a protective layer around it. It also has reserve chondroblasts to continue building cartilage. So we'll see this similar situation in our bone tissue. So cartilage has no blood vessels. Again, it's between 2 bones. If you don't want those bones smashing up against each other and blocking off your blood supply. A lot of your glycosaminoglycans, so a bunch of collagen fibers giving it that flexibility, but also good structural support. And depending on the fibers in the cartilage determines the type of cartilage it is. So we have hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, as well as elastic cartilage. Okay, first one, hyaline cartilage. So very thin collagen fibers, very easy to see through, so it kind of gives it a clear glassy-like appearance. Here, going back to our round structures, we have our chondrocytes, our bigger round cartoon-looking eye section are the lacunae. So this is the little cave that they get trapped in. And then up here we have our perichondrium, where we have more chondroblasts being ready and able to build more cartilage. So this helps with at our joints, even though this example is shown for our trachea. Oh, well, actually it's main bronchi. Trachea is up here. Also in our long bones as they grow, we'll talk about that in the bone chapter. Also found in what's called articular cartilage. So these are found at articulations, which are the joints between bones. Okay, next type is elastic cartilage. So still kind of having this round shape, a little bit more thicker fibers. These are elastic fibers, so it gives it more of a stretch, still covered with perichondrium, still having those chondroblasts on reserve. So for example, your external ear, nice and floppy. The epiglottis, which is the top part of your larynx, or where your voice box is at the top of your throat. So that little flappy piece of cartilage that also helps when you swallow, helps to block off your air pipe. So the food slides over the epiglottis, kind of like, literally like a slide, and slide it into your esophagus. Okay, last type of cartilage is fibrocartilage, so a lot tougher. This one's not as flexible, but you don't want it to be because you want to give good structural support. So example being in between your vertebra. Nice, thick cartilage. As your vertebra is holding the weight of your body, that gives nice, good cushion. So resist compression, so not as stretchy and movable as your other ones. Helps to absorb shock. So again, all this extra weight being stacked on your vertebra, that helps to prevent them from banging up against each other. So other locations, the pubic symphysis, which is the joint between your two hip bones. So that's on your bone exam. Your menisci, which is on, I think that's just a regular test, but the joint, actually chapter 9, the joint that helps with your knee, and then of course our intervertebral disc. Okay, next type of connective tissue, bone, which technically has its own chapter, which is why we only get to so much on the detail, but we will do more extra stuff for that whole chapter. So this connective tissue, instead of having fibrous proteins that are hanging out and everything is nice and flexible, this type of connective tissue is calcified. So we'll talk more in that chapter on how the minerals are added to bone to give it that more solid structure. So each bone of our skeleton is an organ. And inside our bone or osseous tissue, we have spongy bone on the inside. It's covered by compact bone on the outside. So different look in how they appear. So spongy bone looks like sponge. So it has a bunch of holes in there. Compact bone is where you have way more minerals and very little space that's left over in that structure. Okay, major feature of our bone. So just some vocabulary. So in our compact bone, we'll see a structure called the osteon. Helping to build these structures, we have our osteoblasts. So again, our blasts are our builder cells, except for now in bone, it just has a special name. So osteoblast is that one. So when these blast builder cells build up essentially trap themselves into a lacuna, just like in cartilage, when they are trapped in that cave, then they become osteocytes, which are the mature ones. So these, again, they are still monitoring the tissues, able to communicate, tell your bones, well, now really your osteoblasts, how to adjust making your bone so that as you're doing bone remodeling, that you're accurately putting your structural supports where they need to be. So for example, like when a woman becomes pregnant and she has this shift in weight, her body's going to adjust, her bones are going to adjust, and having to build support in order to handle that. Okay, so one feature that isn't in your other connective tissue is that bone has these what's called osteoclasts. So their job is to dissolve bone. So as you are remodeling your skeleton to handle different stresses, you have your clast cells that are going to remove bone. Your builder cells are going to build bone. So they work with each other not only for building bone, but also storing and removing minerals from your bone. So remembering that your bone works as a storage place for calcium and phosphorus. So we'll talk about that more in chapter 7. Other features of the bone, we have our caniculi. So for our osteocytes, they have these extensions off the cell, and they go through these little canals in order to communicate to other osteocytes. And just like our cartilage, we have a sheath covering on the outside. There's also a few other layers, but we'll talk about that later. This periosteum is on the perimeter of that osseous tissue, and that also adds an extra layer of protection. So this is around the whole bone or the whole organ for the skeletal system. Okay, so looking at compact bone. So going back to our round structure here. So in the center of these osteons, we have a Haversian or central canal. So this is where blood vessels and nerves can run through lengthwise in the bone. The layers of cells are built by your osteoblast, and then eventually they become your osteocytes. So those layers are called concentric lamellae, and they just form around your central canal. Okay, this is the last one? Yeah, it is. Okay, last connective tissue. So last one is blood. So again, our circular structures, except for their cells. So we have our red blood cells that are stained red, and then the white blood cells, when you stain them with the stain that you use called Wright stain, causing them to be purple in color. So here's an example. This is a bad one because I didn't have the buffer because it wasn't there, but whatever. The stain is kind of purpley looking, and so that's how your white blood cells end up looking purple in your sample looking here. Okay, and these little tiny little dots, those are cell fragments. Those are called your platelets. So in your blood, transport cells, which are these, as well as anything that is dissolved in your plasma. So nutrients, waste, hang out with the hormones, gases, that can transport around the body. You have that. The ground substance for this connective tissue is plasma. Need to know that for the tissues exam. The formed elements, so the solid structures, are your erythrocytes, also called your red blood cells. So they'll transport oxygen and they can transport carbon dioxide, even though that's not their main job. We have leukocytes, which is the category of white blood cells. So we have 5 different leukocyte categories. You don't need to know the 5 in AP1. You will need to know them for AP2. So we have our neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So an easy way of remembering that, using the first letter, never let monkeys eat bananas. So that's going to come in handy, AP2. The last one are platelets, which again are cell fragments, but they are heavily involved with blood clotting. And we're going to stop here for part 2.